Well, I guess we are live for the moment. Welcome to Evolution Hour. Let me get our little whiz-bang opening credits going here. We will see whether or not Jackson is able to show up, or whether or not Colton and a few other people that we have apprised of tonight's topic will be arriving or not. It's been a busy day on the debate and discussion front, so everybody's got an awful lot of things going. Troubles in Paradise Project, or TucanWordPress.com. Everybody can make use of that. It's all a bunch of open access material. Dan Stern Cardinale was apparently debating Kent Hovind on sundry matters that I got to take a look at, and I've seen some people watching the show. Lots of things that were going on. Anyway, I'll wait and see whether or not we've got a live stream going on here or not. Whether or not that's coming up or not. And Lisa for Truth, let's get this party started. Yay! We've got live feed, so we've got our chat overlay. As everyone knows, the series at the moment is a scholarly analysis of replacing Darwin. Nathaniel Jeanson's cute little book that doesn't actually replace Darwin, and also doesn't have an index, and also doesn't have a reference bibliography, so it's kind of hard to tell what's going on. So I've been constructing a reference bibliography on that. We're going to be having a two-topic subject matter as usual, the material on Jeanson, and then also a discussion of Michael Oard and Ice Ages, which is kind of fresh in my head for a variety of reasons, because creationists do not allow more than one Ice Age. But first, let me thank all of our patrons. Without you, life is more difficult to get by month, and we always put the link up in the description for anybody that wants to go to our cute little Patreon site at, let me see, what is that one? Patreon.com/DownerdTip, TIP, real easy to remember. And everybody that can help on that is much appreciated. Our colleagues at the moment are Hendrel, Bolton, Eric Rowley, Surison, Zeshi, researcher levels, Travis Adams, Ian Chen, Convertney, Stephen Early, Neil, James Fitzwater, History Minor, Ralph McFadden, Apologia, Benjamin Simpson, Speed of Sound, Studio DM Wing, assistant researchers, Command Cyborg, Doranku, Jelly, Totus Real, Christopher Johnson, friends, Stephen Bauman, Marigale Beddoes, Daniel, Insects Are Cool, The Lavender Lady, Morton Nielsen, Paul the Skeptic, Buffalophagus, Hobo Rasmussen, Evan Reeves, Alex Stone, and Paul Williams. And I will continue to thank all those who helped in times past: Jen, Jody, Mike, John, Keith, Andrew Dyer, Yui, Mona, Brad, Daniel Johnson, Danya, Staggle, Sun, Sky Stone, Ugly German Truths, Everett Vincent, and Sewer Weisbaum. It's as a Social Security person and book royalties, which are all available at Amazon, and a Patreon, that's my income source in that for the moment. Lisa asks, why would they believe something that requires a change in the physics of the universe? There we go. That's, well, young Earth creationism gets into this mess in a way that conventional intelligent designers and old Earth creationists don't. They can accept the geology, they can accept the age of the Earth, they can accept the Big Bang, all of that stuff. They don't fill in a lot of the details of what's going on inside that, but nonetheless, they've theoretically got that under God. But young Earth creationism, by compacting everything together in a tiny time frame, requires shredding virtually all of modern science. And that brings us to Nathaniel Jeanson. This particular chapter 7 is showing a sea change at the reference level. Up until at the moment, he's been averaging about 1.1 sources per page. So we're hundreds of pages into it, or 178 pages into it. We've only got a few hundred sources involved, so it's a small reference field. But about half of it was from technical literature, of which about half of that he was misrepresenting the content of when he was bumping into it. Virtually no authority quoting, however, which is very different from a lot of creationists. Now in this chapter, he's doing some barrage documentation for basically his creationist dogmas. And in this particular paragraph, he has a bunch of footnotes to supposedly how creationists have done things so well. Next week, we're going to be dealing with the remainder part. The first footnote refers to accelerated radioactive decay, which, for those people who are aware of the science field, is not a thing. The idea in the creationist model is that since there's all these radioactive elements around and you can track how long they've been doing their thing by the decay products and the balances of stuff, you can do radioactive dating. And therefore, things are thousands of years old by radiocarbon dating. Anywhere you can date anything out to about 50,000 years that way. And other radioactive things with much longer isotope times can date things millions of years old and even billions of years old, except they don't allow that. So one way is to just deny that any of that works, and some creationists can take that model. Others will take a different approach. What if the decay rates could be speeded up? So all of those processes are taking place, but rapidly, without anything different happening. This I would call the cake bake problem. That you can imagine that you can put your cake recipe ingredients into the pot or pan and just jack the heat up and bake the cake in like a tenth of a second. Nope. Some things take time. Some chemical processes take time. And radioactivity is one of them, in that if you try to speed up the radioactivity, you are functionally scramming all of the heat generated by that radioactivity into a tiny time frame. That's one of the problems with it. And the other problem is that you've got mixes of material where creating that much heat all at one time is going to vaporize the planet. Jackson and I made some discussions of that regarding uranium and lutetium and some of the little things that Andrew Snelling has kind of tiptoed past, and John Woodmarapp and others have played around with. And it's a dirty little secret in creationism that this heat problem is really difficult. Vandalia is flipping between this and Dapper's after show from Dan's debate against Kenty. Yes, it's I got to take a look at that, because I don't wish upon anybody to debate Kent Hovind, but there's so much fun to it. And what I've heard, I wasn't able to actually watch the debate, but it sounds like Kent was in a quandary as to how he can get past his rote repetition of stuff in relation to genetics and various other factors in geological phenomena and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, Slade come here says, "How you doing, James Downard?" I'm muddling along. That's why I plug the books. The royalties help. Why I plug the Patreon account. As is usual for people on YouTube and who do this route, there are more people who are subscribed to a channel than actually watch it, and there are more people who watch it than act as patrons. And I never want anybody to spend money that they can't afford, but if they've got the ability to, like, say, yeah, the amount I would do on a latte every month, I could plop on to a Patreon. If enough people do that, that adds up. And so I've just been bumping along after Social Security or income tax, paying that. That was higher. I mentioned in previous episodes that was something somewhat higher than I was anticipating. It's annoying when there are billionaires that pay less income tax than I do. What's wrong with this picture? Anyway, that's how I'm doing. By weather-wise, the big heat wave that's about to hit and is hitting in some places in the United States is also, we're getting odd temperatures here at the moment. It's a fairly comfortable 60s, but we're going to be shooting up into the 80s and 90s next week, and that's about 20 degrees higher than what it typically does here in later June. So we're on like a roller coaster. Welcome to the 21st century and climate change. This is what's been going on all this time. Anyway. Back to topic matter. Lamont says he asked Kent how there is evidence of Native Americans here in America 8,000 years ago if the flood was 4,000 years, and his answer was ancient Egypt lied about their reigns of their pharaohs, which has nothing whatsoever to do with the question that you just asked. And that is a matter that Jackson and I are be going into great detail on in volume 2 of The Rocks Were There, because that whole matter of the peopling of the Americas, Egypt is a different matter altogether. What Kent just said about Egypt is wrong. No, there's not a lie about the ages of things, and there's a very meticulously constructed Egyptology, which, by the way, creationists don't do. And there's a small number of creationists that basically go, nope, can't be, because the problem is the Egyptian chronology spreads back into pre-dynastic times and straddles the entire flood era, and particularly the pyramids. They were in pyramid building mode at the time the flood was supposedly happening. So it's been a thing that creationists have not permitted there to be a valid chronology outside of this tiny, narrow biblical framework. And by the way, it's an extremely selective one, because in fact, even if you add up all the patriarchs and try to find out how the older Earth is, you come up with different dates, and this can spread across 1,000 years or more. And creationists often in the Kanthovian field don't know that, because they only read other narrow creationists, and they restrict themselves to Bishop Usher class creationists who take a particular date for the flood, all of that. And it's all ludicrous data selection. We're going to be discussing that in considerable detail. In fact, I was just working on segments of that before the show started. Lisa for Truth. The China never noticed the flood either. They do have a flood story. It's not really like the Noah story, but creationists tinker with it to make it like the Noah story. And you have a whole, again, this is all the subject matter that we're going to be discussing, Native American flood stories or not. And another big problem about the Egyptians is they don't have a flood story like a Noah story at all. And in fact, the only flood things they have is, the Nile isn't flooding on schedule. And because it was a time of ruin when the water wasn't coming down properly. And it's related to larger climate issues and all sorts of things that were going on, and cycles were working out, and the headwaters of the Nile, there would be droughts, and sometimes caused by volcanic eruptions that could interfere with things. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on there. And so the various flood stories, people who live in river valleys that flood have, surprise, surprise, flood stories. People who live near the seacoast where there can be tsunamis in tectonically active areas, surprise, surprise, will have flood stories. There's stories of flooding in the Pacific Northwest where, surprise, surprise, there were catastrophic glacial floodings occurring at a time when there were human beings here to have noticed. And it has been incorporated into their legend. So you got all of this material knocking around in there, but not the little silly cartoon version of the flood, very specifically at 2350 BCE, which is the Kanthovian style and Answers in Genesis style Bishop Usher format of chronology dating. Anyway, back to accelerated radioactive decay. This footnote that Jeanson had turned out to be a vomit of creationist sources, not listed as you would, even though they're in their technical journals, a lot of them. You list them all by the web address. So you got to manually type in the web address from the physical book and hope you didn't type anything in order to track them down. Well, I've been doing all of that. And he's got a bunch of stuff which turns out to be all from Russell Humphreys, who is the accelerated radioactive point man. He bounces around stuff for AIG and ICR and some for True Origin. His stuff has appeared in various venues over the years. The problem is that not only has nobody in the regular geoscience field adopted accelerated radioactive decay, like genetic entropy, it's not a thing. It's preposterous. No evidence for it. That Humphreys doesn't seem to think so. And the problem is an awful lot of creationists don't think so. And there is, in fact, creationist pushback, which we have alluded to in Rocks Volume 1, about serious doubts about radioactive decay as a model for things. It's just a tremendous mess with trying to have that stuff because it generates way too much heat. But Jeanson is much dicier here. He just relies exclusively on material from either Humphreys or people pushing Humphreys. So he's got a 2011 thing from Humphreys, and then he's got a 2008 thing from Jonathan Sarfati that simply channels Humphreys. And then we've got Humphreys 2005 and 2006 and 2008 and 2010. It's just a methodical repetition of one version of the argument, which, if you read some of the web links in there, some of them refer to responding to critics. Well, who are these critics? Jeanson doesn't say. As it turns out, ironically, we can find out who some of the critics are at arm's length because Andrew Snelling mentioned some, and so did Humphreys at one point. And two of the links that I'll be putting up are actually to exchanges that Humphreys had with one of the critics, old Earth creationist Gary Local, who had written a letter to the Creationist Journal, and you were getting Humphreys' response, and the file happens to contain both pieces. So you get to find out about a bit of that. But where it really gets into the fun and games has to do with the serious criticism involved. At one level, there's a fellow, Meert, who Jeanson didn't like, and Snelling doesn't like, and Humphreys doesn't like, and they've jabbed back and forth. And I'll be putting a link up to a 2003 research piece that Sarfati at least made a point of linking to, which didn't actually contain the quote that Sarfati had discussed Humphreys responding to. So whether Meert at some point edited out that part so that he was cleaning up things, or whether the quote didn't come from that at all, and this just somehow got referenced in there, it's hard to tell. Meert is at a lower level, frankly, than Localt is, because Localt is a scientist that's more in that field, and he had gone on at various lengths on this, not just the little references that we were seeing at Side Route that Snelling was, or that Jeanson was bringing in. But there's also the venerable Henke, who has been one of the bête noirs of creationism for years and has extensive criticisms going on at his site. And it turns out virtually all of the various sources that Jeanson is linking to, Humphreys 2005, 2006, 2008, and so forth, are being discussed in terms of their content in this one particular post from 2010 at Talk Origins. Henke's continued writing material and has posted them in other venues as well since then, but the Talk Origins one is really available and would have been easily enough available. Hi, Lavender Lady. Hi, Diana. How you doing? I know things have been tough for you in the health department. I hope you're hanging in there, kid. And remember the joys of humor and stubbornness. It can get you by often when you don't even realize it. And you have a lot of friends out here who are rooting for you in every way. Elisa asks, seriously, how is decay supposed to accelerate? Yeah, it's kind of magic. That all you, again, it's just exactly like the cake example. You imagine that a thing that takes a process to do can be arbitrarily speeded up, because if all the radioactive decay that's taking place over billions of years is only taking place over the course of like a year or two during the flood, for some reason that we don't know, it's just speeding up, or God decides just to speed it up and slow it down. Who knows what's going on? It's all very arbitrary. But the problem is thermodynamics. It's terribly ironic that young Earth creationists who were so obsessed and remain obsessed about the second law of thermodynamics are crashing and burning on this decay matter because of thermodynamics. You can't take rubbing your hands together really fast, faster and faster and faster and faster and faster, and they get hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. When doing this wouldn't be so bad because it takes a while for the thermodynamics to spread the heat out. Remove that time constraint, and you've got a vaporized planet. And so it's not merely the radioactive decay. The heat problem is terrible. Erica had just done a post on it as well. You've got the fact that if you're moving continents around really quickly, that's producing heat. Same thing you get with the hand rubbing, except on a continental basis. Impact events for meteors. are coming in. We've got massive amounts of that in the geologic record. To have all of that happening simultaneously is more heat. And it's just one thing after another. Now, we know the creationists scratch their heads over this. It's tough to find. We alluded to it in the rocks were there. They've got ones where if you bury down in the footnotes, they've got ones going, there's a problem with this heat thing. We know that. And maybe you might want to look at this, and we can't figure this out, and blah, blah, blah. When you get up higher echelon apologetics at the Ken Ham AIG press release level, they don't mention any of this stuff. And so we have to ask, either Jeanson is so unaware of things that he doesn't know that there's a huge debate internally within young earth creationism, in addition to the Henkeys and Meerts and locals outside of young earth creationism, let alone the fact that the regular scientific community just goes, we don't care anything about you because your idea is nonsense. It doesn't have any support whatsoever. Please don't bother us, kid. Go away. That the fact that in this little one footnote, where he spends half a page practically, let me see if I can find the spot for you to actually physically show you the spot between, let's see, yes, it's about, oh gosh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, about 10 lines of footnote. All, you can see my horrible annotations in here. There, I think. That I had to go through and manually type in all of that stuff. And you'll be able to track down all that and look at it. And anybody, if Colton dives into this at some point later on, he can follow the links up and take a look at it itself. Lisa, for good, gee, could it be that YEC is wrong? Gasp. Yes, that's the short form. And what you find out is you can see the problems in the shell games going on. That if Jeanson were performing the role of a genuine scholar, he could easily take the position, here is our young earth creationist hypothesis. And here is the various criticisms of it from various venues. And here is Humphreys responding to all of that. And Cuddle Bunny, we love Humphreys and we think Humphreys is right. And that he could take that position. It would still be wrong, but still, at least it would be, from a scholarly point of view, it would be an honest one to take. But Jenson's not doing that. He's shuffleboarding the material. He's pushing away any access. So anybody following those trails, if you're methodical enough to type in the stupid things, how are you going to follow a web link in a printed book? You got to manually type it in. Whereas quite a few of these things are from the creationist technical journals. And what you would do in that was a proper citation, which would have had, and a bibliography for it, that would have had the actual title and the volume number and so forth. And you could Google that if you wanted very easily. And you could locate that stuff lickety-split by that route. Not having to type out the entire web link URL and not make a single mistake. So he is making it as difficult as possible, even for you to find the documentation, let alone the various criticism of that documentation. Kenny Henriksen. He's Kenny is our resident creationist who pops in here. We have evidence that Adam and Eve are literal with Y chromosome. Adam evolutionists don't want to admit it because of their religious beliefs. That is false. We may stipulate that you believe that to be true because the creationists of some venue that you copy off of and believe that to be the case. And there's been loads and loads of discussion on this point. Once again, the very religious scientists who work in the fields of genetics and human origins are well aware of the data field, and some can try to push a sort of Adam and Eve model that exists perhaps hundreds of thousands of years ago that's still completely outside the young earth creationist framework. You are not going to find scientists in the regular field supporting these Looney Tunes notions because the facts aren't there. And every one of them, Jeanson, Tompkins, Sanford, Carter, all of the ones who try to do genetic analysis in this area to defend the young Earth model, play fast and loose with the data field. They misinterpret or misrepresent the contents, mutation rates, coalescence values, the pedigree versus oh, what the opposite of pedigree versus something genetic values. Dan Stern Cardinale has done a whole slew of things on that. The difference between the genome of that's inherited in all of your cells versus the stuff that's occurring in the germline mutation rate and fixation rate. These are all various values. Kenny Hendrickson, I did read the papers from ICR. Kenny, but did you fact check the papers from ICR? Have you ever tried to fact check at source level and read outside of ICR to find out what other people are saying on this and fact check the material? And if so, also please do write up your monograph and find some scientists that you disagree with on this point and send your little monograph off to them. And when you've got people with PhDs in the genetic field to agree with you, and they've said, yep, Kenny, yep, you got it, let us know. But until that time, all you are is a silly young Earth creationist who repeats stuff that you never fact check. That's what's the Lisa, ICR isn't real research. Well, it's research if what you mean by research is presenting a dogmatic position that you want to be true and only offering evidence that supports that position and ignoring everything else. Remember, Kenny, I've been at this for decades and have documented now in several books, point by point, source by source, exactly how ICR and AIG and orbiting ones around that, Kent Hovind, Karl Baugh, and others have just blatantly misrepresented their source material. And that has not ever been legitimate scholarship. Yes, it's research. That's why it's called ICR. Research should be in quotation marks with ICR. They do propaganda, and they've been at it for a long time, and it's relentless. If you look through the monthly Accent Facts that comes out, you get the same stuff over and over again. Tompkins and Jeanson and others will do every bloody month another repetition of the stuff that was wrong to begin with, but people like Kenny believe is true because it looks like sciencey stuff. It's got footnotes and references, and it's got pictures and stuff. And they ignore all the parts that don't fit. And we know in human origins that there is no way that you can make the distribution model from Ararat in the flood fit the information that we have about existing types around the world. And creationist attempts to wade into that area very quickly bogged down in the same way that creationist geology, which we're going into in really more detail even than volume 1, can never fit the flood model because the flood model is false. That there was not this cataclysmic event 4,500 years ago, and the various geological events that have taken place over billions of years when we're dealing back into the Precambrian can never be shoehorned into that framework and make sense. And when you start reading creationists at the detail level, where you find out the people at ICR are disagreeing with people at AIG, that are disagreeing with people at CMI, that are disagreeing with people in these others, because they are colliding an attempt to make a semi-detailed model. Floating forests, as an example, accelerated radioactive decay, which is the topic of this one, and catastrophic plate tectonics. They've got buzzwords up the yin-yang, but every attempt to apply these to detailed data fields at the technical science level have disintegrated. And if you read more about the subject, Kenny, and those who want to be Kennys, you discover all of this. Lisa says she doesn't have the patience for that shit. Sorry. What I do, this is in effect my retirement job, is constructing serious source level analyses of creationism I started it in the TIP project, which was material from that I built up from the 1980s through to the early 21st century. And then for the books, we've been kicking into high gear in book mode, primarily because also I needed to have the extra revenue. So there's a little bit of income coming in from these books as a consequence of that. Jeanson and I are very proud of the rocks we're there, and I am very proud of Evolution Slam Dunk. I've been pleased with the reaction that it's got from people who are scientifically trained in these areas. Christine Janis, the mammal paleontologist, adored Evolution Slam Dunk. That's her field. And she even learned technical information that she had been unaware of because of how thorough the old RJ is on ferreting through source material. And the fact that the source methods analysis is actually my gig. That's what I was trained in college, is tracking down sources and evaluating them in a historiographic context, the history of the history. And you've got, yes, Kenny's just zipping along in here. Kenny is very good at wasting everyone's time, including his own. I've never seen him say anything other than dogma. By all means, go on, make a YouTube show and present whatever your dogma hour and see what happens. I, meanwhile, when I bring material up, as everyone who knows from the show, that after the finished posting has gone up, and I go in and put in those linkages to the material so that anybody that can follow up on what we're talking about, and if they can find instances where I've been misrepresenting sources, give it a whack. But I don't think I have done that. Whereas I can observe creationist after creationist. We could ask Kenny, name a creationist by name that you think has never done a misrepresentation of sources. I know by inspection, Dwayne Gish, Henry Morris, John Woodmorath, Michael Oard, Andrew Snelling, Steve Austin, on and on and on and on and on. Nathaniel Jeanson, John Sanford, Robert Carter, and of course the idiots like Kent Hovind and Carl Baugh and the flock running around in the cryptozoology, flood footprint topology, and all of that stuff. John Morris as well. There's just a huge swath of ones that I know by direct source inspection that they've misrepresented sources. So Lisa for Truth brings up endogenous retroviruses, ERVs. That too, there is a huge creationist literature dismissing endogenous retroviruses and their evolutionary implications. And if you read ICR and AIG, you can just spend forever going through and seeing their technical refutations of the evolutionary implications of endogenous retroviruses. And everything in the endogenous retrovirus field supports creation and blah, blah, blah. They insist. And if you try to track down the linkages as to where they're getting their information from and what claims they're making, and does the sources support the claims they're making, their arguments disintegrate. And that's why they have made no impact whatsoever in the regular sciences, literally, as long as I've been alive. Creationism was kicking in, was just coming on the scene when I was just a little kid. It really started to get active in the 1980s on, when they were trying to get their equal time laws in the schools. And there's a bunch of postings at my website, Troubles in Paradise, where I present a lot of that history from the early days of the Scopes trial down to the Dover trial in the 2000s. One of these days, all of that material I will be revamping and updating for a future book, Kulturkampf, which will discuss in detail creationists and intelligent design efforts to co-opt the educational system for their theological agendas. And there it is. But at any rate, I encourage everybody, and Kenny, I would encourage you to move beyond. Whoops, we just got an announcement. Somebody has got a emergency alert here locally that a man with dementia was wandering around and gotten lost, and so an Amber Alert thing was stuck on. The advantages of cell phones and things like that. There's weather alerts and all sorts of things can come through, or if we ever had a nuclear attack, you would get the warning to bend over, kiss your ass goodbye in enough time to be able to maybe do that before you become an incinerated pile of ash. Anyway, happy days. But anyway, all of this is about the whole. Kenny asked, what's your best piece of evidence for evolution, apart from the fact that you don't know how to spell peace? I would reference the reptile-mammal transition that I wrote a whole bloody book on. That is, there's vastly more than just that. Some can, you theoretically can discuss genetics and developmental biology and all that, which I did in that book, and we also brought up in the Roxford area too. There's a pile of material. But for me, the thing that impressed me, that made me from somebody who was skeptical of evolution growing up in my background to somebody going, yeah, that's it, that's evolution, is the reptile-mammal transition. Because it would require a designer to have gone out of their way to have deliberately littered the science data field with evidence that supports that hypothesis, including predicted fossils, the probenognathus. And I documented in meticulous detail in Evolution Slam Dunk, which is why it impressed Christine Janis, exactly how every single anti-evolutionist who has ever dived into the reptile-mammal issue, and there's only 20, screwed it up, including Duane Gish and Michael Denton and Steve Meyer and Bill Dembski, and it's just right down the line. It's a hilarious matter. You get lower echelon ones like Krieger at CMI and David Kopej, the perpetual little nudge creationist that used to be with Jeff Olson Lab. There's a whole bunch of cast of characters here, but there's an amazing amount of science material. And for me, the reptile-mammal transition that involves the jaw and our ear bones and the embryology and the genetics of all of that, a designer would have had to have been gratuitously adoring of evolutionists, to have gone out of their way to design things that made sense within that framework. And the fact that creationists are so adept at ignoring and sidestepping that material, there's been a couple people who've criticized Evolution Slam Dunk in the SFT orbit, and I'm going to be alluding to them in volume 2 because we're picking up speed to refer to how people have responded to the various criticisms since the first book came out. Oh yeah, the Lisa for Truth. Yes, Lisa's not alone. Used to be a YEC. I know all your useless arguments that fall apart under scientific literacy. And in fact, most of the various critics of creationism that I'm aware of were raised as creationists. And that would include Gutsick Gibbon. That would include, I believe, Dapper Dino. That includes an awful lot of people. I'm not one of those. I didn't come up from raised in a creationist background. I had encountered it in the 1980s as a consequence of the dinosaur paleontology thing that was becoming really big deal at that time. And I dived into dinosaur paleontology with a vengeance at just the time that young Earth creationism was doing all their equal time legislation. And that's when Noah's Ark and the Flood and all the young Duane Gish, Henry Morse books and all that came in. And because I've been reading this so long, and it's been helpful in the rocks were there, Jackson, my co-author, who is presumably still at the aquarium doing the job, his side job while he's in college, I had to do as well when I was in college. I had a tutorial job. He was a tutor. I was a teaching assistant as well when in college. But he would not be viscerally aware of what creationists were arguing back in the 1960s, long before he was born, whereas I was reading their stuff. So I know how creationism has evolved over time, ironically enough, and has given up and mutated on tons of positions. Plate tectonics being an example. Duane Gish's era, continental drift, no. Nowadays, they have super fast continental drift. That deep problem again, bringing back to that little side issue. Oh, and we are past the half hour, so let me not forget part 2 of the show, which is Michael Oard and the Ice Age stuff. The creationist dogma is that there was one Ice Age, and they're a little squishy about it, but it usually means the flood comes in, and then during the murky, busy phase after the flood, as continents are shifting around in ridiculous ways to get into the present configuration that we see, and Mount Everest is being pushed up, and Mount Ararat is being pushed up, an ice age takes place. And the problem is that there's lots of evidence for lots of ice ages, not just one. Back in Louis Agassiz's day, when he was pushing an ice age, they could imagine that there was only one. By the way, it wasn't even his original idea. He borrowed it from somebody else. So he nicked it. But at any rate, in the time since the 1850s, it had become increasingly aware that the kind of signs of glaciation that were occurring, erratic boulders where icebergs are, the glacier pushes stuff out, so glacial moraines, it carves out distinctive shaped valleys. There's a whole bunch of stuff that as they grew more and more familiar with the geology of older and older areas, showed that there was more than one ice age. And just today, I was reminded about the fact that Philip Williams, who thinks he's found Noah's Ark up on Mount Ararat, which, by the way, Andrew Snelling insists can't possibly be true because Mount Ararat, in their model, didn't even exist as a mountain. Being a volcano, it's pushed up after the flood. And so you get these colliding dogmas going on. Anyway, Williams, when I debated him just a little bit ago, and Otangelo Grasso was involved as a potted plant. So basically, it was me versus Williams. I decided I wanted to interact with him about a subject he had brought up in a previous debate with David Neff, which was the Harappa culture of India. Well, India happens to have not only two examples of volcanic deposits that date to two different periods. One is the end Cretaceous, that's the one that's at the time the dinosaur extinction is taking place, and another one earlier when India wasn't even in the middle of the Indian Ocean, which was during that first one. It's down by New Zealand, and India used to be parked down next to Antarctica and South America and Africa and all that at the South Pole. And there's an ice age in the tip of South Africa that at the time it was occurring in the Silurian, it was down in the southern hemisphere. And so the ice is going from the pole northward. There you go. Williams, without any familiarity by his own admission with any of the science material, pronounced ex cathedra that Silurian ice age was actually from the Pleistocene. Why? Because he's got to have just one ice age. That's the ice age that he thinks is the flood, and it isn't even the normal flood. And he's not not a young Earth creationist, but he acts like one, as he just sucks in material from completely disparate time frames. So we've got Slade brings up Slade was raised in a creationist cult called Delphin. Lisa says raised IFB. Yeah, that's independent fundamentalist Baptist. Yeah, there's various. If you have a non-partucan mind, the sort that really will, if you get the information, you start paying attention to information, that it matters. And you're raised in a creationist background, and all you knew was the information that you were being presented. And you eventually discover that information was actually misrepresenting the stuff. Apologia has the same. One of the patrons or our project here is one of those that came through that background. And he's a way more recent ex-young Earth creationist. Erica and Apologia, this only been like in the last few years. There's been a rapid movement. Colton is another one that they basically spent most of their life on that, but then they bump into the bigger world, and that can act as a traumatic realization that you've been lied to. Maybe that the liars were honest liars in the sense they really believed all the stuff they were repeating over and over and over again without ever fact checking, but it still was a lie. And that can be traumatic to where some will go on and actually lose their faith altogether because they were that disgruntled by it. In the same way that there were people who have had child abuse experience. Roman Catholic Church has gone through that it can lead some people just to drop the faith completely. Because how could their God have been so hypocritical and oblivious to all of this? So there are downsides in terms of proselytizing to trying to maintain an exceedingly rigid dogmatic position. And if you're doing it by wholesale repetition of a prior argument that you've never bothered to fact check. Anyway, I'm keep on digressing because I want to get to the Oard Ice Age thing. That the dogma is in young Earth creationism that there's one ice age. And Michael Oard just put up a posting from last year that I'm putting the linkings up to that he offers a really tendentious criticism of multiple ice ages. And cited along the way only two actual technical sources, one of which unfortunately isn't available online, but I was able to find a counterpart paper that they did that is available online from Quaternary Science from 2007 by Walker and Lowe. There's also a 1994 paper from by Phillips and Held that reflected the very early attempts to model ice ages at a theoretical level. And of course, 1994 is 25 years ago, kids. So that means that like there might have been work since then. And did Oard cite any of that work? Give you 3 chances on guessing what the answer to that is. And if any one of them is no, no, or no, you win absolutely nothing because we're not giving out on any prices. But that's what was the situation. And it turns out all of that field is really interesting. And I was able to get Oard briefly cited Vincent 1999 on the evidence of some Antarctic lakes. And that's available public access, so I was able to put that link up. But somehow Oard didn't mention any of the details of that show that they have a perfectly natural explanation and they aren't fitting into any creationist model. And those were in exactly the same issue that the original article was in. As one would expect, the scientists kept studying the lake bacteria, as noted by a 2014 paper from Fox. And Trender 2014 related that to yet another paper. And we've got Lyons et al. 2016 on identifying the lake constituents that relate to this thing. It's underneath the ice thing. There's a little body of water that can occur. Bodies of water can occur, or they can be ancient lakes that get covered over by ice that can be detected by various means. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on. And then we've got so all of that you can follow up on. One of the particularly silly arguments that he offers is the ice should have picked up innumerable trees and vast amounts of other vegetation on the way if these were present. Charlesworth states the rarity of vegetation in the drift glacial debris suggests that the pre-glacial material was carried beyond the limits of glaciation, unquote. And when was that book done? 1957. That's almost as old as I am. You think there's been work on that topic since then? And the other issue is, what is he imagining that there's like a forest landscape and the glacier comes in like a steamroller and picks up all of that stuff? Again, wait a minute. Is that how glaciers move? Are they moving that quickly? Or is it that in an environment where there might have been certain kinds of trees, a glacier coming in is altering the habitat and the trees can't quite make it there anymore and die off? The plant balances alter, all of that stuff changes. So it's not a fixed thing by the time the glacier gets to it. None of that sinks in with Oard. All he wants is the authority quote that he can wave at the audience to say the thing he wants to be true, and never mind what happened, never mind how old it is, never mind what's been done on it since. That, for if Kenny is still in the field, that's the problem that creationists do. It's a shell game. It's like 3-card money, the little thing where the person says, find the little P underneath the shell. They've in fact removed the P. So no matter what card you pick, there's not going to be a shell under there because they cheated. And that's what's happening in creationism. And so what the scholar can do is identify where the cheating is taking place, identify where they're trying to put the P in really quickly and then take it back out again because they haven't followed up on any of the other material, and they make no effort to point you in those directions. They don't want to have you studying up on things. Kenny should bear witness for us whether he's ever tried to fact check any of the things he reads at ICR or any other creationist website. Or what if he means is he reads what they say and he believes what they say and he repeats what they say, and that's good enough for him. And here's where it connects up with the religious mentality. Isn't that what many people do with their Bible or their Quran or whatever religious scriptures they deal with? There is the sacred word that is accepted without question, that is believed in because that's what it says, or some version of it that's been selected for you by the preacher that has decided which versions they want to pay attention to, and they ignore the parts that don't fit. And this happens over and over and over again in how people can bungle up material. You get it in the Daniel prophecies in relation to the supposed second coming. You get it about the problems about how you actually go about dating those things. Going back farther into Genesis, the various difficulties in pinning down what the original source material was, and the unreliability of certain passages in terms of trying to treat them as gospel. You can't do that any more than you could a telephone directory or a book written by a mortal person in our times. They can be perfectly accurate, or they can screw up, and there can be a typographical error. There could have been a misrepresentation. There could have been the wrong information put in. This happens. Humans do that, and that happens with religious documents as well. But the religious document people can't accept that, so they have to have a separate mode of scholarly thinking, or the perceived truth can never be wrong, versus the normal world where they use a completely different set of stuff. Nobody would buy a car, would they, without checking out, kicking the tires, looking at the thing, inspecting it, finding out whether or not there's been a bad record on their repair issues and recalls and all the rest, all of which they would do what we would call scholarly research. But for certain topics, ideologues, religious, political, will turn the brain off and go into Tortugan mind shell mode and only pay attention to the parts that fit the things they want to be true. So that's how that all connects up to that source methods thing, which is the underlying superstructure of the Troubles in Paradise project. And we allude to it explicitly in the books that I and Jackson and I have done, and we're going to continue to do so. That's the drum beating that we're making. Source methods matters. Nobody can believe a thing that is really not true unless they have bad source methods. They have to, one, have a tendency to rely upon an extremely narrow source base that they don't fact check. Two, that narrow source base behaves in exactly that same way. Three, they really never quite think through what they think happened. I call that the map of time in relation to evolution issues, but there's counterparts of it in other areas. But what do you think happened? Tell us what you think happened. This happened, and this happened, and this happened. Can you be specific? Can you incorporate all the data in your this happened, this happened, this happened thing? If you can't, screwed. And if you're not paying attention to most of the data field, which I objectively measure creationists don't, they're missing 90% of the data field. So you got a narrow set of people that are believed in without fact checking, who misrepresent source materials and are paying attention to only a limited amount of data field, who can't apply even that to a clear model of what they think happened, and then no standards for changing their mind. What would persuade the believer that they were wrong? What would evidence need to look like of a transitional form? Literally, none of them have ever thought about this, just as none can work through connecting speciation processes up in the fossil record. I don't have to guess at this. I read their stuff. Their brain shuts down. So those four dynamics are how a mind can manage to come up to believe something that isn't true. And it's just as so of the Kennys in the young Earth creationism movement as it is of flat earthers, or people who believe the moon landing was hoaxed, or people who are COVID anti-vaxxers and Holocaust deniers, and people who think anybody but Lee Oswald killed Kennedy, or people who think that somebody other than Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare's plays, or people who think they're a fairy folk, or think that tarot cards can tell fortunes, or there's a whole disparate groups that sometimes cross-connect culturally. You find the cryptozoology branch of young Earth creationism, for example. You find intersections of things. But underlying it all, one ring that rules them all, bad method, the goose egg. And they will all be making exactly the same categories of mistakes that it helps explain how it is they can come to believe things that aren't true. And when you find people who have given that up, some of them may still be Tortugans that have sloppy brains. Ian Plimer comes to mind as somebody who's an anti-creationist, it often gets into trouble because he can be dogmatic, and he's a climate science denier. So that Glenn Morton is ex-young Earth creationist, but he's also something of a climate science denier, and we allude to that in the work as well. So there's little baggage that people have in the methodology that can pop up in a variety of contexts, but always the same bad method. Lisa for Truth brings up the Kent is fixated on the Miller-Urey thing. Yeah. Indeed, and that's true of most biogenesis apologetics, which they're just obsessed about the Miller-Urey experiment, often misrepresenting what it was set up to do and what it actually found. There's an awful lot because they discovered, for example, that as the Miller-Urey team began to improve the atmosphere things, because they'd gotten criticized that the atmospheric model was probably wrong, that they would start out with, the idea was you put in gases and hit it with a electric discharge, lightning bolt, and you get amino acids. And that some of the ones were unrealistic because they realized, there actually wouldn't be as much methane and so forth and so on, and you need to recalculate. Well, they changed the atmospheric mix, and it turns out you could still make amino acids that way. And in fact, a recent work, I think it was around 2009 or so, went back because the vials of these later experiments that had just been left aside because they didn't have the tools back in the late 50s and early 60s to even evaluate what was in the gunk. The kinds of analytical tools we have today are vastly more sophisticated, and so there were vials that were never looked at the time. They were just sludge. So now, using modern tools, they went in and looked to see what the sludge was, and it turns out that they were even better in making amino acids than they realized once they started to make the atmosphere more like what the atmosphere was likely to be. Ta-da! By the way, Sygart and I will probably be having a discussion maybe later in the month. The date's kind of still being settled on about biogenesis. He's a religious believer, a theistic evolutionist, and I'm a non-believer, just general evolutionist. And it's not going to be a debate. James's Modern Day Debates hosting the thing, but it's just going to be a discussion because we think both of us agree that the abiogenesis issue is a fascinating scientific problem, and we want to thrash about what the issues are, what the work has been done, and where things are going on, all of this. And it won't be about whether there's a designer or not involved or any of that, even though both of us have very different perspectives. Just looking at the interesting areas. So Answers in Atheism. Hi, RJ. Yes, hi. There we go. Hi. We got our little guests in here. We're almost up to the end of the hour. Lisa for Truth says, reading through the Bible on my Saturday live stream, the Bible contradicts itself. Yeah, unfortunately it does. And that's one of the very early tests that I was starting to discern about this Tortucan mindset, is if you have a person who can read the Bible and not see internal contradictions in it, that's telling you about what's going on in their head, their ability to just not see something that's there. And Yesai is a great guy. He's affable enough. We can disagree on a lot of issues, but still, I thought it would be an interesting subject that he broached to me. And I said, yeah, actually, I would like to discuss that. Not a debate, just a discussion. Because the field is really burgeoning and has transformed enormously abiogenesis work in just my lifetime. Because I was in the era of just the Miller-Urey types experiments, and there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then in laying out more and more of the parameters of what was going on in early life systems and what problems still need to be resolved and where things will be going in the future and all of that. I think it's going to be an interesting. So we're just about down to the end of the hour. I will do, let me put my little commercial up here for the rocks were there. That I should tend to forget. I tend to forget about that because I get jibber jabbering on things. So since Jackson is not here, we can proceed accordingly. We'll share our screen and let that run while we've got our thing going here, and we'll let that run. So that's a little promo Peter worked out for our book, The Rocks Were There, Volume 1. We're both busy beavers working on Volume 2, which is only there because we got to the stage where we realized the work was so huge that we physically couldn't put all of it in one book. So basically, we cut the thing in half, which turned out to be kind of nice. It worked out to 7 chapters in one and 7 chapters in the other, because one of the chapters is a reprise and update for the previous book. And the second one will be just as careful and documented and indexed as the first one. Anybody that is at a technical level will find lots and lots of technical material. And oh yes, we got a little that one up there. Be on his channel this Saturday, talk about American history. And I think that's also going to be an intriguing subject matter. We'll stop our sharing on that one. The history is my actual gig, and it bumps into lots of stuff in terms of dealing not only with science topics, which have a history. There was a time when people believed differently than what we have, and now how did that come to be? That's history. And political history certainly pumps into us because so many of the issues that we're grappling with today are not unique. They didn't come out of a box just because of Donald Trump. They've been issues that we've been grappling with as a society from the beginning of the Republic and even more. And the political parties that have come and gone over the years have dealt with a lot of that in the personalities that were going on. How much of the Democratic Party that we know came about because of people who couldn't stand Andrew Jackson. And so it's a very intricate little area, and I'm not universally knowledgeable on the subject for some of the period in the Federalist period in particular, but I have the basic outlines of it, and then we can get into other areas as we start moving on into the 19th century and the 20th century, where we're now starting to bump into the areas that connect up even with the area that I would just call, in general, the culture war struggle. You've got political sides that have bigger issues at stake than just tariff policy, and that plays out with that. So anyway, I think it'll be a fun and game discussion on there. So if anybody got any last minute questions, toss them our way, and I will be perfectly happy to answer them. Otherwise, we'll be shutting down for the night until next week, and continuing work on my books and all the other little projects to go. Become a patron if you can. Pick up either fiction with Paralogs of Fog or nonfiction for the science part. If you can't do either of those in your networks, spread the word about the project. Tell people about it. Say, hey, have you heard about his books? Have you heard about the project? And urge any of them to come. If you are already a patron or have already bought any of the books, tell people about them and say why, if you believe them to be worthwhile, why they should consider them worthwhile too. I'm not rolling in dough in the way that Ken Ham is at AIG, pulling in 150 grand a year, or Steve Meyer at the Discovery Institute pulling in 150 grand a year, or various other. Even Ken Hovind has his little cult enclave of supporters in that regard. And if you look at the number of likes and the revenue that comes in for flat earthers and people who just believe claptrap, I'm here as somebody that you could support in a grassroots area that can matter in terms of dealing with clarifying people's thinking on a lot of subjects, in addition to just the surface content level. It's also the underlying method underneath. So there's the thing. I guess that's just about it. We're past the hour. No questions. I shall say everybody stay safe. There's still mutants going around with the COVID virus. If you haven't been vaccinated, be vaccinated. If you haven't been vaccinated because you have some weird political view that makes that strange for you, rethink your political view, because there's something dangerously wrong with that, and you're endangering and imperiling other people in the Republic. Some states and cities, Seattle, with all of its ups and downs, is apparently at about 70% vaccination rate now. Vermont just hit that level. Areas down in Trump country in the South have been way behind on these things. That's going to be a difficulty for them. Even neighboring Idaho here is much less rigorous in this matter than we are over in Washington State. And so people are interacting across the border. So stay safe, everybody. Get vaccinated. Wise up. It's the 21st century. And Anderson said they dropped below 100 for the second day in a row in Minnesota, first time since March 2020. Expect more heat wave knocking around in there. We'll be lucky here of being only 80 or 90s next week, and we have low humidity here, which in Minnesota and places in the eastern area of the country, the humidity is such that when you slap that 100-degree temperature, you're turning into a puddle. You turn into a puddle at 70 degrees. with the humidity that high. So I do not envy you in the slightest on that, Minnesota and parts east. Take care, everybody, and